It's great to be back with you again in study as we pick up on study number 4 of the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and Jesus, as we're looking at these ancient prophecies of the Old and the Hebrew Bible and how that's been carried over into the New Testament, how Jesus is the fulfillment of those prophecies. And as the New Testament writers continue to lean on that incredible old narrative that is so pertinent to not only who they are, but who we are, how that is being fulfilled in Jesus the Christ, and how many of these writers, gospel writers included, are showing how this fulfillment is taking place. So glad to have you back, but let's join with a word of prayer. Blessed God, we give you thanks for this day that we can join together again for study and for fellowship. Bless our time, open our hearts and our minds to the movement of your Spirit. Lord, we ask this in your Son's name. Amen. As last week, this week actually came on, I got lots of text messages and things that said my video last week, my microphone was extremely quiet. So I want to offer just a couple of points to you from last week's study as we looked at the ancestry of Jesus all the way up to right before the study of his birth narrative as it comes out of the two of the synoptic gospels. And I wanted to remind you that of how important Jesus' ancestry is to who Jesus is. The gospel writers take lots of time, lots of space, lots of words to remind us that Jesus isn't just someone who comes out of nowhere. Jesus is a part of a lineage that goes all the way back to Abraham, goes all the way back to, if you look at Matthew's genealogy, even Luke's genealogy, you go all the way back to Adam in Luke, but you also go to Abraham in Matthew. And how important it is that line weaves itself from Abraham all the way down to Jesse, to David, to Joseph, to Jesus. Tying Jesus to that line, tying Jesus to all that, not only provides the lineage, the family tree that we love to do. I know in my own family, I love to look at the genealogies and who is who and trying to figure out names and all that. But it also tells us that the prophecies that were talked about in the Hebrew Bible that are connected to the fulfillment of this person, this Emmanuel, this God with us, all come to fruition in Jesus the Christ. That all these people have fallen in line just perfectly to get us to this person. And so Genesis, in the book of Genesis, that was chapter 22, where God is speaking to Abraham, that Jesus is of Jewish descent, an incredibly important factor to remember, that Jesus is from this incredible Jewish line. We then jumped over to Numbers as we began setting up what Jesus is going to do through Balaam's oracle. We looked at two things that are talked about: the star that connect us to the Magi and what the Magi see rising in the east. And then this language out of verse 17, that a scepter will rise out of Israel. We spoke a little bit about that scepter, that the scepter itself, a staff or a wand or an insignia, scepters were used as a sign of power and prestige, even a sign of an office that was granted upon someone. The scepter that rises out of Israel, though, is two things. The first is a person who embodies God's kingdom, the Emmanuel, and two, as a sign, a cross that would represent ultimate sacrifice out of love. In that understanding of what a scepter is, a scepter rises out of Israel, we have one person who draws together both things. Jesus, who is the Emmanuel, who is God with us, will then at the end of his earthly life hang upon that wooden cross for our sake. We jumped then into Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 11. We looked at the stump of Jesse, and we continued to talk about David's line and how important it is to connect David and Jesus. But not only that, Isaiah starts to use language about baptism, something that the gospel writers will pick up on much later on. We even use it in our own liturgy. I pointed you to the ELW, our cranberry hymnal, to page 231, where we have this beautiful language, a spirit of wisdom and understanding, a spirit of counsel and might, spirit of knowledge and a fear of the Lord. We know that the heavens are ripped open, to use the Gospel of Mark's language, and that spirit descends like a dove upon Jesus. That language is picked up in that narrative as well, and it comes right out of Isaiah, as Isaiah is talking about Jesus the one who is to come, the one who will grow from the stump of Jesse. We then also again talked about in 2 Samuel that this one who is coming is very different than all the other ones that have come. This one will establish a kingdom. His father to him, and he shall be the son to me, as God is talking about this one that is coming. That this one will not, his God's steadfast love will not ever come away from him. God's steadfast love will always be with him. Jeremiah and 2 Samuel, they speak of Jesus' lineage, how important it is once again to remember Jesus is a part of a much longer line, a much larger tree. And then they additionally, both of them speak about a new beginning being found in the one who is to establish a kingdom. This kingdom won't be like anything we've ever seen. It'll be completely different. And that kingdom is because that kingdom is rooted in God. So even as Nathan is talking to David in 2 Samuel, the tones here in this particular text, chapter 7, foretell of what God will do far beyond the pages of David's story. There are tones here that pull greatly on our Lenten heartstrings, as we've just come out of Lent not all that long ago, as we think of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, that his request is to take this cup from me, but not his will, God's will. Jesus was the one bringing God's kingdom into this world. He was the Emmanuel. He is the Emmanuel. He is the one who is God with us. And because of his activity and because of what he's done, now his ministry begins and he fulfills what these ancient prophets have talked about. He indeed has brought God's kingdom. So in a nutshell, that was study 3. I know that was fast, but that was study 3. Study 4 that we would pick up on today is from birth into the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. Now, we're not going to get all the way to his ministry today. We'll pick up on that next week because I wanted to spend time in study 3. So I made this one a little bit shorter, but we're going to look now at the birth narratives. We're going to look at the 2 synoptic gospels. Remember, the word synoptic means synonymous. We have 4 gospels, and of the 4, 3 are considered synoptics: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They are synonymous in their stories. They're not exactly the same, but they pull on similar sources. These sources share similar storylines, similar language. You'll also notice as you read the Gospels, and I encourage you to, if you haven't, read them from beginning to end. I invite you to start with Mark, though. Mark is kind of the Reader's Digest. It's compact. Mark doesn't spend a whole lot of time on detail. He's not a fluff and guff kind of person. His community is not a fluff and guff kind of community. They are taking it straight. They don't need anything around it. As you get into Matthew and you get into Luke, you'll begin to notice that those stories begin to get expanded. Not necessarily in a bad way. They're just elaborated on. More seems to be shared. These communities are sharing more that is important to them. But Matthew takes a little bit different twist. Matthew's coming at it from a very, very Jewish perspective. Someone who's rooted in the power of the Jewish law, the power of the Torah, the Hebrew Bible. And Luke is writing to a very different crowd. Luke is writing to a crowd that is seeking to understand, what does it mean now that this person has come into the world? We also get voices in Luke's gospel that we don't get anywhere else. We have Mary's Magnificat. We don't have that in any other gospel. We have a birth narrative, and we have the road to Emmaus story. That the birth narrative falls in Matthew, but it's a little bit different. But we have the road to Emmaus story at the end of the resurrection. Oh my gosh, we have all these pieces. So these gospels, while they pull from similar things, are slightly different in their encounters with this story of Jesus Christ. That isn't to say that they're full of errors. That isn't to say that something is wrong. One of my professors when I was an undergrad used to say that it's as if you've all gone to see a movie, and then you come back to a central location, and every person is then asked to tell the story of the movie. We would all, based on our own experiences, pick up on different things that happened in the movie. None of them are necessarily wrong. We would just see something different because of our own experience. Or our language would be very different based on how we retold the story. Maybe because we come from a different background. Maybe because we have a very high level vocabulary. Or maybe you're like me and you just kind of hear these wonderful words and go, oh, that sounds pretty good. I wonder what that means. But as we bring all that together, our stories then become who we are. So if we were to do the very same thing, that's what would happen. That's where we would be. So that's where these gospel writers are. Of all the sections of Jesus' life, the birth narrative, the one that normally falls right at the beginning of the Gospels, as it is found in 2 of the 3 synoptics. Now, the birth narrative is only found in Matthew and Luke. It is one of the most familiar stories we know of. We've all been in Christmas programs. We've all seen different renditions. Our day school program does a great retelling of it every year. We've all done that. We've all played sheep and goats, and some of us have been Mary or Joseph. We've stood at the manger and prayed that if we had a real baby in our midst, that the baby would make it all the way through, or that someone wouldn't fight over the toy, all those kind of things. We've all been there. So Mark's gospel, though, it doesn't fit within that context, as I said. Well, there's two of them, right? There's Mark and John. So Mark's gospel begins with the fulfilling of John the Baptist proclaiming that Jesus has come. So it begins right at the beginning with John's voice. John is the one who brings the Gospel of Mark into play. And then as Jesus comes to see John, John is found at the River Jordan. John is baptizing, and lo and behold, who is there but the Son of God? And the Son of God comes to John, and John says, "Oh, what are you talking about? I can't baptize you." And Jesus says, "Yes, you can." And he does. And that's when we have that beautiful moment that we talked about when we were looking at the Isaiah text from the study of last week. That is, the Spirit of God descends upon Jesus. This incredible moment happens. A side note to that, if you remember, at the very end of Jesus' earthly walk, when he is hanging upon the cross, in the Gospel of Mark, as Jesus takes his last breath, he's had that incredibly passionate moment, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," my God, why have you forsaken me?" That comes right out of Psalm 22. As Jesus makes this impassioned plea and then passes away, then dies, the curtain of the temple is torn in two. You remember that? It's ripped in two. That word is schizo, to tear, to rip. That same word at Jesus' death is the same word we find right here in Mark's gospel. The exact same concept. The heavens were wrenched apart. They were torn apart as the dove descends. Which I think is an incredibly neat tie to the beginning and the end of Jesus' life and ministry, as it is found in this world, as he's walking and talking to the disciples. So John's gospel then begins with the fulfillment of the prophecies out of Genesis. Now, we studied that a couple of weeks ago. We looked at John's, called the prologue of John. John redacts, he changes, and he reorients the opening part of his gospel to be very reminiscent, to reflect Genesis chapter 1. That as God is moving over the waters and calling forth life, John immediately takes that image out of our brain of God and says it's God in Christ, and begins to build Trinitarian theology right from the very, very beginning. So both Mark and John start in a place that they assume that you and I, as the hearer and the reader, we know who Jesus is. We know how we got here. They just assume that we have it all figured out. At this point now, in their own Gospels, they immediately Mark then starts with the call stories, as John then begins to build into who Jesus is going to be. John coming at it from a theological standpoint, Mark from a Reader's Digest standpoint. Going to take all the finer details, just give you the main points. Neither of them, as we said, have a birth narrative like Matthew or Luke. Both of them assuming we already know the story. We're going to jump right in to the ministry itself. So for our conversations here, we're going to look at Matthew chapter 2 and Luke and other places as well, more along the lines of chapter 3. But first, we want to go backwards a little bit. We're going to go to the book of Micah in the Hebrew Bible. We're going to look at Micah chapter 5. We're going to look at verses 1 through 5. And as always, I'm using the New Revised Standard Version for my translation. We pick up at verse 1. "Now you are walled around with a wall, siege is laid against you. With a rod they strike the ruler of Israel upon the cheek. But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrath, who are one of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has brought forth. Then the rest of his kindred shall return to the people Israel. And he shall stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they shall live secure. For now he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be the one of peace. If the Assyrians come into our land and tread upon our soil, we will raise against them 7 shepherds and 8 installed as rulers. As we hear this text out of Micah, it's very easy to hear King David in the text. David is the one, especially if we think of David's actions and his leadership, David is the one who unites the nation of Israel into one flock. David brings the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom and brings them together. He brings all the clans, all the tribes, all 12, brings them all together as one unified nation. He feeds his flock, he brings about peace, all those kinds of things happen. This is also reflected in 2 Samuel chapter 5, this way of thinking, this idea of thinking, where the prophet in 2 Samuel writes, as the tribes are talking to David, for some time while Saul was king over us, it was you who led out Israel and brought it in. The Lord said to you, it is you who shall be shepherd of my people Israel, you who shall rule over Israel. So even the prophet in 2 Samuel is struggling with who is this person, this David, this character that's going to unify the nation. But when we think about Jesus, and we think about Jesus as the Emmanuel, Jesus unifies God's people in a very different way. Jesus brings them together, not as a nation with a hierarchy in a sense, but in a nation and as a people who are not only serving others, but are living out of a place of being given something that they've never been given before, something that no one of this earthly world could ever give, this gift of salvation and eternal life. So as the Matthean writer, as Matthew's community comes together, Matthew saw Micah's prophecy as something more than King David. King David had lots of faults. King David was certainly not a perfect person by any stretch of the imagination. He was a unifier, but he was sinful. He did some things that were atrocious. He killed people, he had people killed, and he took wives that he should not have taken. All of that to say that in Matthew's eyes, and Matthew is a writer, Matthew is a community of people, a Matthean community, David was not that person. David was just someone else in the great long line of Christ's own story. Matthew saw that in this text, Jesus, the one born of a woman in Bethlehem, the great shepherd of the sheep, which is picked up in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 20, the one who would bring peace, was the one that Micah was writing about. Peace is shalom, a holistic peace. Not just a moment of, finally, but an entire body, a being of peace. This person, this Christ, he's the Prince of Peace, as he is called. He's the great shepherd of the sheep, as the writers of the New Testament call him. Jesus embodies what Micah is talking about as a way of not just right now, but for all time. Matthew then makes a pointed reference in chapter 2, leaning on both Micah and Samuel's witnesses through the voice of the wise men. Now, we've talked about them before, the wise men in our study number 3. We talked about the scepter rising out of Israel and how that was the star and the scepter, all those kind of things. We've talked about that. But here, we have a very interesting way, because out of this group, out of this story of Jesus bringing everybody together, as Micah is wrestling with what does it mean for God's people to be unified, the wise men are talking to Herod now. We're in the New Testament. We're in Matthew chapter 2, verse 5. They, the wise men, told Herod, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to be shepherd, to shepherd my people Israel." The Magi have an incredible understanding of Micah's prophecy. They didn't see that Micah saw David as the fulfillment of that prophecy. The wise men, the Magi, see that this one who has been born, who's connected to the star that we talked about in our last study, the star that came out of, I'll get it for us here in just a second, out of our Numbers text from last week, or from our last study, Numbers chapter 24, that a star shall rise, a scepter shall rise. The Magi are putting all of the dots together. Again, as we talked about, they are outside of that center circle. They are outside of the people of God who have heard these stories countless times. Yet it is by their witness into the text that we see these connected points. That Jesus is the one who has come out of Bethlehem. That Bethlehem is not just some small little clan amidst God's people. Bethlehem is important. It's the inaugural place of which Christ will come out into this world to be a part of God's people. That God will rule. God's kingdom will begin in Bethlehem. And that this one who is to rule, who is to bring about a kingdom, as we talked about before, a kingdom that's very different than the hierarchies we've dealt with, very different than the governments we deal with today. A kingdom rooted in God is to not only be the shepherd of God's people, but to bring about peace. As we think about Jesus' life and ministry, his death, now that we're in the season of Easter, his resurrection, as we think about what Jesus embodies, who Jesus is not only our shepherd, Jesus is the one who brings peace. Additionally, as Matthew continues to write and continues to chew upon this prophecy out of Micah, Matthew then sees parallels between this image of a leader struck for their work in the name of God, which comes out of Micah chapter 5, verse 1, and that of Jesus' own trial and the beatings in Matthew chapter 26. That even Jesus himself, for what he has done, for what he has taught, for what he has preached, this contrary gospel to the status quo of life around him, especially from a leader standpoint, that Jesus himself will be beaten to the point of crucifixion on a cross. These ancient prophecies are being recasted. They're being shown, not changed. They're being shown how the fulfillment is being met in Jesus Christ. These ancient prophecies coming to life in the person of Jesus the Christ. It's important to see this birth narrative as it plays out in this particular text, as it plays out at this particular moment. How important it is that as we think about Jesus' life, as we reflect on all of those Christmas pageants we've been in, we think about the story. These prophecies are coming true. And these gospel writers, they want us to see that. They want us to see how the story is connected. We don't have a New Testament without a Hebrew Bible. We have to have these old stories. So as we build upon this ministry, as we build upon this birth narrative, which we'll pick up on next week, we will continue to see how these ancient stories are coming to life still, not only in our midst today, but in the text we read each and every Sunday. I'm incredibly grateful for your time today, and I wish you all the best in your weekend, and I wish you well as you join together with your faith community on Sunday. And for those that are at Emmanuel's, what a joy. I can't wait to see you in worship. We will meet right again on Facebook, right here on our church page at 10:30 tomorrow. Have a great rest of your Saturday. Let's close with prayer. Blessed God, we give you thanks for your Son, Jesus Christ, for his birth into this world, for the gift of life that he brings. Lord, I give thanks for all the folks who have joined for Bible study now and who will gather later on, for who have clicked, who have passed by, who have heard maybe just a word or two. Lord, I ask that you continue to be with all those who struggle with the coronavirus, the families wrenched apart, for those who have lost jobs, and certainly for those who have lost their lives. Lord, bless us all, keep us safe, help us to have a great rest of our weekend. Lord, we ask this in your Son's name. Amen. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.